So yearning taught me to hear music out of love from the soul for this love.
Welcome, everyone. My name is David Stahl, and I'm president of the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. Today, we celebrate our ongoing partnership with UCSF and the Global Brain Health Institute. This partnership allows us to explore the unique relationship that brain science and music enjoys. Certainly, we all know that music impacts our development as children. But perhaps what is most interesting is that as we age, even as dementia often sets in for patients, they retain their relationship with this art form. This aspect of how human beings connect with themselves, with the world around them, but certainly retain memory of the world around them, is something that fascinates us. And this has allowed us to come together, not just to bring our resources towards advancing science, but also in offering presentations that combine scientific work with wonderful musical performances. Your topic today at the Alzheimer's Association of addressing health disparities as it relates not just to Alzheimer's, but all dementias across the world is something that inspires us. Today, you'll be hearing from artists, particularly in the field of jazz. Jazz is perhaps the most powerful means for us to think about not just empathy, which is central to our understanding of others, but improvisation, human expression, and certainly the complexity of music. As we explore how jazz allows us to cope, communicate, but most importantly, understand each other, I think this can be a pathway to us understanding the differences between all of us, but recognizing that all of us are one community and that all of us deserve access to the most extraordinary forms of treatment science can offer us, and certainly better lives. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. I'd like to thank my great colleagues at the Global Brain Health Institute for their terrific partnership. It is a pleasure to work with them. And so, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Victor Valcour.
Hi, thanks, David, for those kind remarks. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to today's event on jazz, equity, and brain health. This is the fourth in a series with our partnership with the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. I direct the Atlantic Fellows for Equity and Brain Health program at the Global Brain Health Institute, and this is highly aligned with the work that we're doing. I'm proud to share that we've now formalized our partnership with the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, so you can expect more programming to come down the pike. I want to particularly share a warm welcome to those joining us from the Alzheimer's Association's conference on addressing health disparities. Thank you to the Alzheimer's Association for holding this important conference and partnering with us for today's event. The determinants of a healthy brain are rooted in the social determinants of health, many of which are modifiable, and they're driven by the same disparities that drive other illnesses, factors such as poverty, access to care, access to a healthy diet, and the fundamental right to an education. We believe that addressing modifiable risk factors can reduce the frequency of dementia by as much as 30% in high-income countries and maybe as much as 50% in low and middle-income countries, given that the risks associated with these inequities are greater. For example, illiteracy, which is a worldwide problem. To do this, we must focus on addressing health disparities. Today's event merges our knowledge of genetics and dementia, as well as how we at UCSF are addressing brain health disparities in the San Francisco Bay Area. We will also learn about the challenges and strengths of communities and neighborhoods through an exploration of jazz. Music comes from our brain, and jazz particularly highlights the resilience in our brain. We believe that the arts and their connection to brain health, including their role in healing. I want to introduce to you Dr. Maria Carrillo, who is the Chief Science Officer of the Alzheimer's Association and is joining us for today's event. In addition to her leadership in this position, she serves on the Atlantic Fellows for Equity in Brain Health Governing Board. With support from the Alzheimer's Association, our fellows receive pilot funding to address inequities in brain health in their home communities. To date, we've funded over 2 million US dollars for work in over 40 countries globally. And this pipeline program has led to an additional $27 million addressing equity in brain health globally. Dr. Kriya, thank you so much for your leadership and for joining us today.
Thank you, Dr. Valcour. It's such a pleasure to be here, and it's just been such a phenomenal day, and this is just icing on the cake to participate in this event and be able to take it all in over the course of our time together. I want to add my welcome to all of you to the Jazz Equity and Brain Health event here. First, a special thanks to the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, to UCSF Memory and Aging Center, and of course, the Global Brain Health Institute. And before we enjoy the next hour, our next time together, I want to provide some humbling facts on why brain health and equity are so important for all of us. Alzheimer's and other dementia affects more than 6 million people in the United States alone, and there are more than 11 million caregivers. Almost 2/3 of Americans with Alzheimer's are women, and older Black Americans are about twice as likely to have Alzheimer's or other dementias as older whites, and older Hispanics about 1.5 times as likely to have Alzheimer's or another dementia. There's a lot of work to be done. You just heard it from Dr. Valcour. And there's a lot to be done in terms of dementia broadly, but especially within the context of understanding social determinants of health, understanding diversity, equity, and inclusion in this field in particular for the most vulnerable. This is the main reason that the Alzheimer's Association and the Global Brain Health Institute have such aligned missions and visions. And I'm proud of our continued collaboration because we do more together and we get farther together. So this is a big moment for the Alzheimer's and dementia community, not only these past few days, but certainly what you've heard from last week's news about a new drug being approved by the FDA. This is the first drug for the underlying biology, regardless of how you feel about the data. And I know that the conversations are very diverse as all of us. But at least we know that even if it's not a cure, it's hope for those living with Alzheimer's disease and their families that need more effective treatments. But knowing that 99% of the trial participants were non-Hispanic whites increases concerns that many of us have, that we've also voiced about the drug's efficacy and perhaps how it works among our diverse and underrepresented populations, including mine as a Mexican-American woman, as a first generation in this country. So what can we say about this new drug? At least we can say at this time that even though we don't know how effective it might be in underrepresented populations, there is also zero evidence that it won't work for us, regardless of the discussions that are taking place across the country. Today is a new day for Alzheimer's research and even treatment, but we have to acknowledge that health inequities increased exponentially the minute that drug was approved. And we must all work together to battle that inequity in particular. But over the last couple of days, we have hosted an exciting meeting on health disparities and dementia conference, a commitment we started over a year ago in collaboration with the National Institute on Aging that has joined us to co-sponsor this meeting. We had such powerful discussions, and sometimes they were uncomfortable conversations, but these must be heard, and we must do more. We have to continue this conversation, and we will certainly tomorrow with 2 focus meetings that'll take a deep dive into disparities specifically addressing American Indians, Alaskan Natives, and LGBTQIA populations. But today, we're coming together now to talk about jazz, to talk about music, which, like science, connects us all in one way or another. I love the title, Jazz Equity and Brain Health. The goal of our event today is to explore othering and belonging through the lens of jazz music and understanding the impact it has on our brain, on our well-being. We build community through music, through jazz, and we can explore empathy and the power of listening and inclusion that is inherent in the roots and spontaneity of jazz, and how it impacts the brain through our musical notes and through the promotion of togetherness, bringing people together from all backgrounds for the enjoyment and celebration of our humanity. Again, thank you to the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, to UCSF, the Memory and Aging Center, GBHI, our partner, virtual hug for our partners on this event. We're such proud collaborators with you. And thank you for all you do every day to address inequities in every realm, but in particular to fight for brain health and to end all dementia. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Amelie Anna, and I just graduated from the inaugural class of the Roots Jazz and American Music program at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. I'm excited to introduce my dear friend, mentor, and director of the jazz program, Jason Hainsworth. He has taught me so much about the importance of building community through music. His personal story of discovering jazz as a child and what that meant to him, how it changed his life, is very compelling. Jason, take it away.
A little bit of background about myself and my relationship to jazz and how important it is for me. I'm originally from Houston, Texas. I'm the youngest of 5 children. My mother was a nurse, and music for me was a way not only to get out of the neighborhood, so to speak, that I grew up in, but as a way, as a very quiet, shy boy, to express himself in a way that he probably couldn't with words. I grew up in a pretty rough neighborhood. My mother was fortunate, and I was fortunate that I was able to get bussed out of that neighborhood basically every day from kindergarten until 12th grade to attend various schools literally across town. And I began to play music in those elementary school and middle school and high school bands. And the thing that really struck me was as my community, as my neighborhood began to realize that this quiet, shy boy that wasn't doing drugs or hanging around with the wrong crowd, they saw me walking around with a saxophone case, and they left me alone because they saw me walking around with a saxophone case. And over time, as I began to get older and older, and going through the 80s and through the crack epidemic and what have you, those people that were oftentimes drug dealers, drug pushers, they began to actually tell other people to not bother me as well. So those very people that were doing these ills in our neighborhood, they saw that I was trying not to do something like that, and they essentially became some of my strongest protectors, and they looked out for me as I was growing up. This period in which we're living, where our eyes are finally being opened up to so much racial inequality, societal inequality, I think now is the time in which a sense of community is needed more so now than ever. And I hope that this dialogue that we will have and that we are fortunate to take part in is just one step in hopefully improving how we relate to one another, how we empathize with one another, and how we progress not only as musicians, as physicians, but also just positive members of society.
It's now my pleasure to introduce Doctors Sergio Lanata and Jennifer Yokoyama, both rising stars at UCSF and within the Global Brain Health Institute. Dr. Lanata is an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Neurology and a faculty member for our Atlantic Fellows for Equity in Brain Health. Originally from Peru, he leads our community outreach efforts through innovative programs that are underway in the San Francisco Bay Area. He is an inaugural recipient of the Population Health and Health Equity Award within the UCSF School of Medicine. Dr. Yokoyama is the Mary Oakley Foundation Endowed Professor in Neurodegeneration and an Associate Professor in the Department of Neurology at UCSF. She leads our mentoring effort for the Atlantic Fellows for Equity in Brain Health. She also leads the Neurogenetics and Aging Lab that studies genomic variation and its influence on brain anatomy, physiology, and cognitive behaviors. Her lab studies genomic variation as it relates to vulnerability and resilience against neurodegenerative disorders in aging and diverse populations.
Hello, it's my pleasure to be here with you. It's also my pleasure to participate in this event, Jazz, Equity, and Brain Health. As you heard, I'm Sergio Lanata. I'm a behavioral neurologist at the UCSF Memory and Aging Center. And today I'll be talking to you about this important concept of social determinants of brain health in the context of work that we're doing in San Francisco to address these determinants. I'll be centering my talk on our current understanding of Alzheimer's disease because this is the most common cause of dementia worldwide. We know this is a neurodegenerative disease of the brain that leads to very different clinical signs and symptoms or clinical syndromes depending on how the disease affects the brain. And we also know that this disease does not affect every racial and ethnic group in this country equally. In fact, Latino Americans, African Americans carry a higher burden of Alzheimer's disease relative to white Americans, for example. Research over the past few decades has shown that there are certainly key modifiable risk factors that, if not properly addressed throughout the lifespan, can increase one's risk of developing this disease as well as other forms of dementia. These are medical conditions such as diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and also behavioral or lifestyle factors such as lack of physical activity, lack of exercise, heavy alcohol use. All of these factors, if not properly addressed throughout our life, can increase our risk of developing Alzheimer's disease late in life. So when we think about the racial and ethnic disparities that surround Alzheimer's disease, one hypothesis for explaining those disparities is that perhaps those disparities are the result of upstream disparities involving these modifiable risk factors. In other words, that differences across different racial and ethnic groups pertaining to these modifiable risk factors are what drives the observed risk factors surrounding Alzheimer's disease. And certainly there is data to support that. If you look, for example, at just San Francisco, rates of diabetes and hypertension across different racial and ethnic groups, you will find clear differences across groups. And the same is true for different health conditions as well as behavioral and lifestyle factors. But the question then is, what is driving these disparities? What is the root cause of these disparities? Well, historically in the US and in other parts of the world, the reasoning behind the primary drivers of these disparities has been based on the idea that there are biological and cultural factors that are embodied by people belonging to each of these racial and ethnic groups that are in turn driving these disparities. That there are genetic variants, for example, that drive the high prevalence of hypertension in Latino Americans and so forth. The problem with this mode of thinking is that although biology and culture certainly play a role in dictating health outcomes, they don't tell the whole story. And in fact, genetics teaches us that we cannot really think of these racial and ethnic groups as being biologically driven, because most human genetic variation, it does not happen categorically between racial and ethnic groups, but it happens as a grading across racial and ethnic groups. And this is something that my colleague, Dr. Yokoyama, will tell you a little bit more about after I'm done with this talk. I think the same is true of culture. If you think of culture as being, everything, right, that we are, our language, our thoughts, the way we communicate, how we behave, our customs, our beliefs, etc., it's very difficult to think that there is a Latino culture, for example, when you consider that Latin Americans that are living in the Bay Area come from all over Latin America, Mexico, Central America, South America, and all of these immigrants bring their own belief systems that oftentimes have nothing in common, and then these belief systems further change through their lived experiences in San Francisco. So it's very difficult to think that there is a Latino cultural factor that is the primary driver of these observed health outcomes, and I think the same is true of other social groups. So this brings us to the concept of social determinants of health and the social determinants of brain health, which I suspect are the primary drivers of the observed health outcomes that we've been talking about. These are the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age, which are shaped by the distribution of money, power, and resources at a global, national, and local level. Historically, in the United States, the distribution of money, power, and resources has disfavored people of color, and this is true also in San Francisco. So let's explore this hypothesis a little bit. If you look at where racial and ethnic minorities live in San Francisco, they live mostly in the eastern neighborhoods of San Francisco. So let's look at what structures look like within these neighborhoods. For example, if we look at a food market score, that is, how easy is it for people living in a specific neighborhood to access fresh foods and vegetables, fruits and vegetables, for example. You'll see that the eastern neighborhoods are in red, meaning that residents living in these neighborhoods do not have easy access to fresh foods and vegetables. And this correlates, of course, with intake of fruits and vegetables in this area, which in turn has a direct consequence on health, including diabetes, high blood pressure, for example. Likewise, if you look at, okay, what are the medically underserved areas of San Francisco, you'll find that the eastern neighborhoods, the ones that are historically inhabited by racial and ethnic minorities, are the most underserved. And this correlates with age-adjusted hospitalization rates for diabetes in these areas. So you have a picture where structures are driving or are strongly correlated, and therefore we suspect are driving the main health outcomes that we see in these neighborhoods. And this is the concept of social determinants of brain health. And this is a concept that is being studied more thoroughly recently. This is a study from 2019, where these researchers were interested in looking, okay, what effect does neighborhood disadvantage have on actual structures of the brain, total brain volume, as well as the volume or the overall health of the hippocampus, a region of the brain that is key to Alzheimer's disease. And they found indeed that people living in the most disadvantaged neighborhoods had a reduced total volume compared to people living in highly advantaged neighborhoods. And also their hippocampi volumes were smaller than those of people living in highly advantaged neighborhoods, highlighting, stressing the impact that that social vulnerability has on brain health. So if we go back to this picture that I showed you earlier, then we can expand it, right? We can think that upstream to these behavioral and medical risk factors, there are these social factors to consider that determine brain health, like discrimination, exposure to discrimination, the type of job that you have, your income, health services, et cetera, et cetera. So we can try to think of a big picture view of things where you can contemplate upstream factors that influence brain health, that in turn influence actually midstream factors that I've already mentioned, that in turn influence brain health outcomes and how these factors interrelate to each other. And that is the interest of our work in the UCSF Memory and Aging Center Community Outreach Program. We've created a map of neighborhood level vulnerability based on data published by the Department of Public Health. And we have outlined the neighborhoods that are most vulnerable based on this data. We correlated this map of vulnerability with a map that shows the representation that we have in our center from each neighborhood, meaning where are people coming to our clinic from and to our research program from. And as you can see, the most vulnerable neighborhoods are the least represented in our center. And we're looking to change this by inserting ourselves in these communities through partnerships with community centers and clinics where we can come to them so that we can mitigate these inequities in brain health. And that's all I have to share with you on behalf of our community outreach program. Thank you so much for this invitation, and take care.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Lanata, for an excellent talk and overview of social determinants of health and how they can affect our brain as we age. So now, before we move on to our next musical segment, I want to take a little time to think about our genetics, the DNA or the genome that defines our human species and also connects us both to our family members as well as to our communities. So for many of you, thinking about genetics might be a little bit different or unusual. So I'm going to walk us through an example, which hopefully will help to illustrate what we're talking about today. So the human genome is made up of chromosomes, which are shown here as visual representations of our chromosomes. And I like to think of our genome as kind of like the cookbook for all the things that we need to make a biological system or a human. Each of the recipes in that cookbook are called genes, and each of those genes encode a certain product or protein that is like a building block. And when we stick lots of different types of proteins together, we can create or build more complex structures, things like cells. And many cells put together can eventually create an entire organism. So growing up, similar to Jason, I also studied music as a child. I did piano and flute, but I was trained much more in a classical area. So I'm going to use an example from classical music here to illustrate my example. So in musical groups and like orchestras, you will have a score, and it shows every different part for all of the different instruments in the entire orchestra, and you have this huge score, and that's what the conductor uses. So it's kind of like our musical cookbook. Within that score, there are different parts, and as a flautist, I'm of course interested in the flute part, and so we can think of those kind of like genes, right? So it's like a single unifying kind of menu for the flute. Okay, so the product of that flute part is a flute melody. And you can imagine now if you had many flute melodies and some clarinet melodies, maybe even an oboe melody, eventually you might get an entire woodwind melody. And so you can think about how if you combined now woodwind melodies together and brass melodies and percussion melodies, then eventually you could create an entire orchestra or a musical ensemble. So sometimes in our genes, there are changes. Sometimes they're small changes and sometimes they're bigger changes. And we refer to these as variants or mutations. And these variants affect not only the gene, but also the downstream products, right? So you have subtle changes in your protein and subtle changes in the cell. You can think of this kind of as if somebody stuck a little Post-it note over your musical part. So sometimes, you know, if you're only missing a little bit of music, you might be able to, for example, improvise, like if you're a jazz musician, and maybe even make the song sound better and enhance it. But if your Post-it note was too big, then it might actually block too much of your musical part, and it would perhaps interrupt or interfere with the flute melody itself. And interfering with that flute melody could actually also start confusing your fellow woodwinds who may have challenges adapting to the change in that flute melody. And so that's kind of how we think about how genetic variation can affect our biology as people. The good news is the great majority of the human genome is actually shared across everyone. So 99.999% of the genome is the same across all humans. It's what defines us as human beings. And only a very small proportion of that genetic variation contributes to all of the differences we see in appearance and in health, including these two lovely individuals from our Atlantic Fellows for Equity and Brain Health program at GBHI. So my lab at UCSF studies how genomic variation contributes to changes in brain structure and function, and how that can impact how we behave and how our brain works in terms of its cognitive processing or functioning. And we think about this both in the context of healthy, successful aging, as well as how it might predispose us to neurodegenerative diseases. And so this is really the kind of framework we're thinking about when we're approaching our research. And so why does studying genetic variation matter? Why is it important? Well, it turns out by understanding what types of genetic changes can impact disease risk, you can actually learn more about the biology of those diseases. It allows us to identify new targets to basically try to treat the disease or prevent the disease from happening. And it can also provide good early biomarkers or predictors of disease risk in people that are still healthy. And so one example from our field is from the 1990s. There were lots of families that had patterns of people having Alzheimer's disease in their grandparents and then in their kids. And so geneticists used the patterns of disease occurring in those families to identify a gene, ApoE. There's a specific flavor of ApoE called ApoE4 that's associated with increased Alzheimer's disease risk. And it turns out that by identifying that genetic variant, They were then able, other scientists were able to go and study the biology of that protein product and understand how it works inside of a cell, kind of shown in this schematic here. And we found out all these different things about how ApoE4 contributes to disease risk for Alzheimer's. And now there are people targeting ApoE4 as a potential new therapy for treating AD or Alzheimer's disease. So next, I'm going to just give you a couple examples of, questions we can think about, similar to Dr. Lanata was talking about, about how we can think about the kind of interplay of biology and social factors in their risks for diseases like Alzheimer's. So one example that we heard from Dr. Carrillo is the fact that women have a much higher prevalence of disease risk for Alzheimer's disease compared to men. Here I'm showing you a graph from one of their reports where purple is the women, and you see a greater proportion of women versus men in orange, showing risk for Alzheimer's disease at different ages. And this could be due to many different things. Some factors that may include the fact that females of all species live longer. So maybe women in general have a longer life and therefore a higher likelihood of getting Alzheimer's disease. There are a lot of historical or social determinants that may contribute to this risk, including lower education in earlier generations of women, as well as differences in workforce participation and occupation based on different social constructs. And then there's hormonal differences, biological differences related to being biologically female versus biologically male. And these differences are in many ways dictated by the sex chromosomes, which are the genetic contributions to female sex. Another example is also a point that Dr. Carrillo pointed out, the fact that white Americans represent a smaller proportion of Alzheimer's disease cases in the United States, yet are more likely to be diagnosed. And here I'm showing you on this graph, the orange represent the white Americans, African Americans are in turquoise, and Hispanic Americans are in gray. This is from a group in New York. And it turns out that in this cohort, as well as in other studies, genetic factors actually don't appear to account for this difference in Alzheimer's disease prevalence across these different groupings. And instead, it's very likely that there are differences in lifestyle factors, access to healthcare, as well as socioeconomic risk factors that are really driving these differences in Alzheimer's disease risk. And so again, very similar to the things that Dr. Lanata was speaking about in the prior talk, where sometimes genetics plays a role, and sometimes it's really these social determinants of health that can contribute to inequities. So as an example, one of our Atlantic fellows, Jorge Guerra, did a study in Cuba where individuals have equal opportunities for access to healthcare, similar levels of formal education, and similar socioeconomic statuses, regardless of how much or little African versus European ancestry they have. In the context of this equal opportunity, there are no observable differences in dementia risk or prevalence, and no differences in cognitive performance among all of the different groupings. So again, it suggests that once you take the social factor out, they're actually, everyone is much more similar than we would think based on our current research. So finally, I'm going to show you some research from my lab where we were studying Chinese Americans living in San Francisco and looking at differences and similarities in our white American cohort that also resides in San Francisco. So here I'm showing you that the Chinese Americans are in red and white Americans in blue. You can look at a clinical measure of disease severity, and they look very similar across all of both groupings in our controls, our mild cognitive impairment, and our Alzheimer's disease cases. When we look at the Alzheimer's disease patients compared to healthy older adults, we see basically similar changes in the brain structure associated with Alzheimer's disease in both our Chinese and white American participants. And of course, we see similar relationships between disease severity and those changes in the brain volume. And so to us, it suggested, well, gee whiz, Alzheimer's disease looks really similar across Chinese Americans and white Americans. And actually, I will say that this study took several years for us to get peer reviewed and published. I think in some ways because people were very surprised that we could statistically combine multiple different groups of people together and show similar relationships in disease risk. We did finally get it published thanks to the resilience of our trainees and visiting scholars. And we do hope that it shows that studying diverse populations can be done through careful study design and will inform our understanding of how genetic, lifestyle, environmental, and cultural factors influence risk for disease. And that's exactly, what the point of all of Dr. Lanata's outreach work is for. So in summary, we are more similar than we are different, and we can leverage a better understanding of our differences to enhance healthy brain aging for all individuals in the world using precision approaches. So what would this look like? In the ideal world, we'll have basically enough genetic information from everyone to understand the biological component of their disease. And we can disentangle that from the social components that may also drive disease risk. And so instead of just treating people based on how they look, we can actually treat them based on the type of biological flavor of disease that they have. And in this way, we can have a more personalized approach for everyone. Of course, in order to do this, we need genetic information for all populations in research. And so with that, I hope you will consider, thinking about how you might be able to get involved. And also, if you're a researcher, think about how you can involve diverse populations in your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for this wonderful and informative presentation and the great metaphors that made the content very accessible. I'm honored to now introduce the next guest, Scott Pingle, principal bassist at the San Francisco Symphony and magnificent jazz bass player. First, however, I invite you to enjoy Scott's and my duet, Centerpiece, a 1958 jazz standard written by Harry Edison and John Hendricks. This particular tune is a blues, a very traditional song form in jazz, which predetermines the chord progression, but nothing else. A jazz duet, especially, is a conversation between two musicians who are listening to each other intently with the goal of understanding instead of responding to the other. If we don't listen to other musicians, we cannot meaningfully create in the moment, since we are improvising, which means we're composing, choosing different notes, different rhythms based on the melody of the tune. We have to be listening to the other person in order to know where each specific musical journey will take us. Without further ado, here is Centerpiece.
The more I'm with you, pretty baby, the more I feel my love increase. I'm building all my dreams around you. My happiness will a house and garden somewhere along the country road of peace. A little cottage on the outskirts where we can really find release. But nothing's any good without you, 'cause baby, you're my centerpiece. the more I feel my love increase. I'm building all my dreams around you. My happiness will never cease. But nothing's any good without you, 'cause baby, you're my centerpiece. I'll buy a house and garden somewhere along the country road of peace. A little cottage on the outskirts where we can really find release. But nothing's any good without you, 'cause baby, you're my centerpiece. But nothing's any good without you, 'cause baby, you're my centerpiece.
Hi, everybody. My name is Scott Pingle, and I am the principal bassist of the San Francisco Symphony and a faculty member here of San Francisco Conservatory of Music. And it's my great pleasure to teach here because I get to work with both the classical students, but also the students in the RJAM program, which stands for the Roots Jazz and American Music. And the reason that's so special for me is because of my own background in various kinds of music from all over the world. And in particular, jazz, which is, I guess I would call it an American art form, but it has its roots in many other places. There's such a wonderful conversation that happens when you're playing jazz. And it's built around the framework of a song. And you have these chord structures and harmonies and melodies, and but yet you're all improvising and kind of making it up a little bit as you go along. You have a great degree of freedom, but that freedom is constrained by these the skeleton of the song. And if you didn't have that skeleton of the song, it could be just potential total chaos. But sometimes that's a little fun too. But so when we're playing together in a jazz ensemble, we don't have all these notes written out for us. Like I said, we just have the structure, the sort of the skeleton of the piece. Usually what I was looking at on my music stand was I just had a bunch of letters and no notes written out, just telling me what the chords are, and I know what the melody goes. But I have to make up my own bass part as I go along. And it has to fit within that framework of the chords. And it's a little bit like life. We have this framework of life that we have to live in, and we got to kind of make it up as we go along, but we have to do it together. And we have to engage in dialogue and conversation and work with one another to try and make something beautiful and meaningful and expressive. And that's hopefully what we achieve in each of the tunes that we play when we're playing jazz. And sometimes it's messy, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's confusing, sometimes it's enlightening, but it's much like life. It's a journey, and that's the best part about it. And going back to earlier in my career, when I was immersed in the jazz world, I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin, and this scene that I got into, a lot of the bands that I was playing in was a mix of people from all kinds of different backgrounds, and that helped bring out a lot of understanding, being around people that didn't look like me, people from different backgrounds from me, seeing each other as individual human beings who are ultimately loved by our God. And I'm so grateful for that, to be exposed to so many different perspectives and ideas about life and music and how we relate to one another. And many of those people became my closest friends and like brothers and sisters to me. And that was through the medium of music. And it's something that's very healthy to have those experiences, both all mentally and physically even, and spiritually. And so I'm really grateful for that experience. I'm thankful to all of you for your interest in this, and I hope that the music that we've played for you will be meaningful for you and And I hope that we can all maintain some dialogue and explore music and how it relates to how people relate to one another and our brain health even more into the future. So thank you, everyone.
It's now my great pleasure to introduce Josh Kornbluth, performer, writer, film and video maker, and Atlantic Fellow for Equity and Brain Health with the Global Brain Health Institute. Josh is doing exceptional work creating the Citizen Brain video series as he spreads an empathy revolution. And he's been performing his autobiographical monologues for theaters all over the US and overseas. Let's give it up for Josh.
Hi, I'm Josh Kornbluth. I'm a senior fellow at the Global Brain Health Institute and the host of Citizen Brain, our video series connecting brain science and social justice. You know, jazz is a glorious example of the human brain's genius for collaboration. Each time people make beautiful music together, it's a victory of belonging over othering. Unfortunately, othering has been having a lot of victories lately. In this excerpt from one of our videos, we learn about the existential importance of human beings choosing to belong rather than pushing others away.
Who belongs? The fate of humanity depends on how we answer that question, and brain science can help show us the way. I want to tell you a story. Actually, I want us to tell the story together. It's a story about how when things are changing rapidly, we can respond in one of two ways. One way is to close ranks with those we consider to be us and try to exclude everyone else. That's othering. Othering comes in many forms, but one of the most virulent is racism. The other way is to expand our conception of us to include as many people as we can. That's belonging. Which way will we choose? Well, that depends on the story we tell ourselves.
So I think the two dominant stories. One is the fear. Those people out there, they're out to get you. They're not like you. You need to be afraid of them, build a wall or kill them. And the other one is one of hope and love. It's like, you know, we share something. We can create something. We share the earth. We share each other. We can learn from each other. So those are two dominant stories. So one is one of fear, one is of hope.
Fear or hope? These two stories have been around as long as there have been people. They coexist because the impulse towards both was literally wired into us. It was a matter of survival. If I'm an early human and you suddenly show up in my cave, I have to decide, like right away, are you one of us? In which case, a nice hug might be in order. Or are you one of them? In which case, we might have to throw hands. And in order to make this split-second decision, my brain does one of its favorite things. It categorizes.
We have a brain that's very good at classifying. We're very good at thinking about who our own group is and who may be threatening to our own group. And I think there are two systems in our brain that sometimes work against each other. So one is the system of fight and flight, and this is a system in the brain that is very prominent in lower species like amphibians and reptiles, and it essentially is involved with protecting oneself from other animals and attacking other animals for food. And then we have this other grander side in our brain, and this is the part of the brain that is involved with nurturance, empathy, self-awareness, being able to think more broadly about the survival of the planet, being able to think outside ourselves and thinking about the importance of others.
Deep down, we all want to belong, to connect, to build things together, to solve problems together. In our heart of hearts, we know that that's what brings out the best in us. But if we live in fear, it becomes more likely that our reptilian side will take over instead. And I don't know about you, but I'm living in a lot of fear these days. So in these terrifying times, how do we keep ourselves moving towards togetherness? How do we keep fear from tearing us apart? How do we call on our better angels? By figuring out how to belong without always making someone other, which can start with making ourselves aware of when our brains are doing the categorizing, shortcutty thing of assuming that if you seem different from me in some way, that must mean that you're out to get me.
I think what's happening is you see someone or a group of people that have a shared characteristic. It could be something external or something in their behavior or something in their way of living, and you generalize, you mark those people, and you start to build all kinds of theories around those people, and you confuse those theories and beliefs as reality. And in that process, you lose sight of the shared identity of people, the shared substance of people.
When we lose sight of our interconnectedness, our interdependence, well, then our humanity drains away. And we stop inventing all the incredible things like schools, libraries, civilizations that come from our species' genius for working together, for helping one another. How can we prevent this from happening? Well, to begin with, we can start to understand that each one of us isn't exactly just one of us. We all have multiple identities, which is to say, we don't belong to just one group. Take me, for example. You may know me only as the impossibly handsome host of this video, but I'm so much more than that. I'm an American. I'm a father, a husband, a brother, a son. I'm obsessed with cute cat videos. I'm one of those people who's always dreamed of becoming a professional basketball player, even though my vertical leap is pretty close to zero. So when I'm thinking about how I can live and work peacefully with you, I'm trying to get all of my identities to get along with all of your identities. But wait, that just seems to make the problem worse. Now all of my us's have to play nice with all of your us's. That's a lot of usifying. Here's the thing though, it's being aware of our multiple identities, our many ways of belonging, that can actually help solve the problem. Because now, when I meet a stranger who seems different from me in a scary way, chances are that in some other way, we're both in the same group.
Your group could be people who have a kind heart, people who care about each other. You could define your group in many different ways. So I think we have to actually help people imagine the future so people quit turning to the past. But we haven't really exercised that.
Wow. It would be so great if we could come up with something that could allow us to benefit from all the things we share without destroying each other over our differences. Well, fortunately, we have. And with all due respect to the wheel and the spork, it's probably the greatest invention that our brains have ever come up with: democracy. A political system that allows not only all of us to participate, but most of our multiple us's as well. As long as we start by agreeing on one thing: everyone belongs.
Hello. So a little bit of information about Take the A Train, I believe, ties into what Josh was speaking of in terms of belonging. Take the A Train was written by Billy Strayhorn for the Duke Ellington Orchestra, and it's the signature piece that the Duke Ellington Orchestra band played nightly for about 50 years. And it's basically about their favorite hometown, their favorite neighborhood, which is Sugar Hill, located in Harlem, which was at the heart of the Harlem Renaissance. So I hope you enjoy it. And it's one of those classic American tunes that you could go anywhere around the world and probably call it and someone would be able to play it. So I hope you enjoy it.
Well, thanks to all of our participants for this beautiful event. It's been filled with great music, great ideas. Jason, Scott, Amelie, Josh, Sergio, and Jen, you brought us a collage of music, words, pictures, and science that tell a remarkable story. Also, I want to congratulate David Stahl, leader of the Conservatory of Music, an organization devoted to music, Victor Valcour from GBHI, organization devoted to brain health and reversing inequity by training global scholars, and Maria Carrillo, leader of the Alzheimer Association, group that supports caregivers while looking for a cure for AD. David, Victor, and Maria, thank you for bringing this event together. This shows creativity and leadership, seeing links where others don't, and creating unique dialogues through music and words that advance all of our goals. Well, I tried, like Jen, but I never developed into a competent pianist. Yet I believe that listening to jazz changed me forever by introducing me to the concept and process of improvisation. Improvisation has given me the confidence to expand boundaries around what a memory center is and does, and to do things that are less traditional, but bigger and more impactful, and to do this with a sense of play and fun. So how did improvisation work for me? Well, first it was Charlie Parker, an inventor of bebop. Through Parker, I listened to unexpected sounds played rapidly, very rapidly. Parker brought me into a different mental space, forcing me to speed up, accept different tempos and predict new sounds. And when he slowed down, the songs were ponderous, mysterious, deep. Indeed, it's hard to imagine a noir movie without a Parker or a Parker-esque piece. Without joie, noir is not noir. When someone said to Parker, "We can't dance to bebop," he answered, "I'm an artist, not an entertainer." And he was one of the greatest artists of all time. As for dance, well, like Scott, I was brought up in Wisconsin where boys don't dance. And so the fact that you couldn't dance to bebop at that time was okay. I couldn't dance to anything. Next, it was Thelonious Monk. Music, like language, is a form of communication that activates overlapping but different circuits in the brain. We're just beginning to understand that neurologic process, that marvelous play of brain circuits. On viewing film clips of Thelonious Monk, one of my heroes, he rarely speaks and his thoughts are short, vague, often hard to understand. There is a disordered pattern of thought. His music, well, that's very, very different. His music has unparalleled clarity. It is fun, quick, novel, witty, sometimes moody. Every composition is infused with improvisation. Monk is improvisation. Perhaps, and we don't know enough about this space, but lack of fluency in spoken language for Monk was a catalyst for him to bring a totally new universe to the world through music. This story of reciprocal circuits that lead to our own individual strengths and weaknesses is an area of active study at the Memory and Aging Center, and is, I believe, a key to understanding and treating neurodegeneration. I wanted to say a word about those brilliant musicians, but I also want to say a word about the brilliant musicians that we heard today. My mother, an artist, always said, it's great to talk about the greats, but listen carefully to the greats among you. And I think we heard three today with Jason, Scott, and Amelie. Two more quick thoughts about today. In language, we talk about critical periods. Susan Curtis at UCLA, a great and brave woman, showed that when someone is deprived of language at an early age, language never fully develops. We don't talk about critical periods for music, but they exist. And the conservatory's outreach, which David talked about today, to children is truly exciting. And it's evidence emerging that early exposure to music leads to incredibly positive structural, functional brain changes that protect the brain, and that this protection lasts across the lifespan. This earlier exposure to music is a unifying feature of the great innovators of modern jazz: Coltrane, Parker, Mingus, Monk, Eiler, Dolphy, Armstrong. Let's create more of these innovators in music through early exposure. And then finally, we're just beginning to understand the power of music as therapy for brain health, neurodegeneration, mood disorders, brain injury. And next I'll talk with Amelie Hinman, Kai Kennedy, and Jenny Gubner about that remarkable space of music as a way of healing and bringing us together. Next, I think we're going to have Amelie. So Amelie, what a magnificent day. You play percussion, you sing with the Blind Bandits, you work with music and film and video games. Yeah. You play with the official Golden State Warriors band. You're the first woman to graduate from the inaugural class of Roots Jazz and American Music, the Conservatory. You bring music to local neighborhoods. Wow. You've told me a little bit about your journey from a small town in Austria.
Very, very small town.
Tell me about that.
I grew up in the countryside in the northern part of Austria, which borders Germany, and I'm super lucky and privileged enough to have been born into a musical family. My mother loved music, and my father is an avid jazz listener, still is. And so my sister and I both got to learn instruments, and everything she wanted to do, I wanted to do. And she was the best big sister ever, and she let me. Not only did she let me, she empowered me. She is my #1 biggest fan. to this day. And because of her, I found percussion, which I consider my first language, and then vocals as well. And as she went into the classical music realm, she's now a violist in the biggest orchestra in Austria. I went into the pop music jazz scene, and because I fell madly in love with my husband who lives in San Francisco, he's a musician too, full-time, I moved here. And the conservatory gave me the second chance to explore my love for music and pursue it professionally. I already had a master's degree in English, philosophy, and psychology in Austria and education. And moving here, I realized this is my chance to pursue this long dream of mine. Yeah, and this is where I am right now.
Well, you're changing our world. And just a word or two about how music is soothing to a musician.
Music is the last thing that goes for me, meaning that when I'm so overwhelmed with the world, with the news, with people in my family and friend circle who are suffering, who I can't help, if I'm overwhelmed with work, music is the last thing that I will say I need to have quiet. So music will always and forever be a soothsayer to me, and a way to put me into certain moods, and also a way to get me out of certain moods. So it has definitely helped me to maintain my mental health, to stimulate my own brain, to inspire myself through other people's music to write my own music.
It's really inspiring to watch and participate. Thank you. Thank you. Kai. So Kai Kennedy is an incredible person. She's an associate professor of physical therapy at UCSF. Also, you do remarkable work in our Global Brain Health Institute around leadership and equity. You're a musician and a scholar. Ultimately, you chose scholarship. But Kai, tell us how you bring music into physical and mental healing in the work that you do with people who are suffering from physical and mental stress.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's such a provocative question to really think about. And if I'm going to think about talking about how I use music to heal, I first want to talk about what healing looks like to me as a physical therapist, and more importantly, just as a living being. Healing to me is about bringing a person toward the fullest expression of self. It's about minimizing the barriers to their self-actualization, right? So as a physical therapist, we approach that fullness through the lens of active participation in life. We assess how well a person is able to participate in the activities that hold meaning for them. And movement then is the medium through which a person comes to participate. So whether it be holding a grandchild, or walking to work, or meeting up with friends, or playing the piano, we all ask our bodies to show up in the moments that are most important for us. In my younger years, I was a musician, not as much anymore, but music continues to be an important part of my life, both personally and professionally, because music, like movement, is a portal. We've heard it several times this afternoon that music is an avenue that we can take to connect to people and places and moments that are important to us. And furthermore, it allows us to connect to ourselves, to who we are underneath our labels, to what we feel, and to how we want to experience the world. And so while we often talk about music as an expression, and it is, it's also a place for processing and for navigating the world around us. So in my clinical practice, like you mentioned, music is a communicative tool. So I'd like to just share one example. I can recall a time when I was working at a neurology clinic in Haiti. Most of my patients there had experienced strokes and had some acute or residual losses in cognitive or physical function, or both. And on this particular day, I was working with one such older gentleman with a left hemiparesis, weakness and neglect on the left side of his body. And we were working on standing and weight shifting so that he could become more independent with walking and self-care. And he was frustrated, right? He was frustrated by what he could no longer do for himself. And for much of our time that day, he seemed either annoyed with me or aloof altogether, lost in his thoughts, like he was somewhere else. And I was speaking with his caregiver, and I learned that he used to frequent Haitian carnivals, and that he loved when the rah-rah bands came through his town, and that he loved to dance. And so I pulled from my years as a jazz trumpeter and I improvised. I went to my phone and I pulled up a playlist full of Haitian compa music and I asked him to dance. And his face lit up. He reached for my hand and he stood and we swayed. And suddenly he was no longer a patient, he was a dancer. And I was no longer a doctor, I was his partner. And together through music, we had left this clinic, right? And met together on a dance floor. So music allowed us to see each other differently, more clearly. It allowed us to connect and to move together. And that music provided healing for both of us.
Wow, what a story. Panelists are going, wow, the audience, wow. And I think that this is why music is meaningful in health. And thinking about improvisation is really critical for us to do the best. Thank you, Kai. Okay. Next, we're going to see just a tiny clip. We're coming to the end of what I thought was a glorious day. This is Vivian Chen. She's a reporter, a famous reporter and a drummer. She cared for her mother with Alzheimer's disease for many years. We asked Vivian to share what music and caregiving has meant to her. And then I'm going to ask Jenny Gubner to comment a little bit on what Vivian says.
If you can imagine, a full decade before the COVID-related lockdowns hit, I was in my own self-imposed lockdown because I had a mother who was a runaway risk and had Alzheimer's and dementia. And during that period of time, I decided that I would take care of her for as long as I had to, which ended up being 7 full years. During this period of time, it occurred to me that if I could not mentally or physically go anywhere anymore, that I would mentally go there anyway. And that's sort of where the music came in. I think what the music brought to me and the way the two kind of intersect, the drumming and the caregiving kind of intersect, is that there was a certain element of empathy that I was bringing to the table. My desire was always to make the group sound good. It wasn't all about me. And I think that was sort of, I was instilled with that as a caregiver, and then I became instilled with that as a musician. So I think that we're just beginning to understand how important music can be in the role of brain health. And that's why I want to applaud everybody for the work that they're doing in this area, because it's hugely vital and hugely important.
So Jen Gubner is going to speak about this. Jennifer is a alumni of the GBHI program. She's now an assistant professor at the University of Arizona. She is a ethnomusicologist. She's done brilliant work on caregivers and hardiness and how caregivers survive working with people with dementia. She's a mean fiddler. Much to my delight, she revitalized the MAC band, which includes Josh Kornbluth in a major role, from everything from accordion to guitar, Jen Yokoyama, Jenny, of course, Camelia Lada. So Jenny, say a word about what that piece means to you, thinking about caregivers and surviving that very difficult process.
Great, thank you, Bruce, and thanks to everyone. It's delightful to be sort of closing off, and hopefully I can echo a little of many things that have been said today. I think that there's a lot to be said about the relationships between music and people living with dementia. Incredible research there. But I think there's been less work done on music in the role of caregiving. And I think if we can look at music as being capable of connecting people living with dementia to their personhood, I think that same mechanism can be used for caregivers, and they need that in the same way. Caregivers need to reconnect to personhood and selfhood for themselves and to connect with the people that they're caring for. So I think in this incredible statement that Vivian gives, that's something that I've seen a lot. We were part of a study working with Dr. Teresa Allison in the geriatrics division at UCSF, where we spent a year going into people's homes and looking at the role of music in everyday life in dementia caregiving relationships. And what we saw were, countless stories of music being very helpful for people living with dementia, but also so many stories like that of Vivian, where people said, getting in my car and blasting music and driving around the block is what keeps me going, or going dancing is so important to me, or playing an instrument. And so it doesn't matter whether you're listening. You don't have to be one of the greats. It doesn't matter if you're listening, if you're playing, if you're engaging, but that taking that time for making music or listening to music can be extraordinarily important. And I think the other thing that Vivian touches on that is so important is this idea of empathy, which has come up throughout today. And I know there's all these parallels between what we can learn from music to put into dementia caregiving, roles. And one of the things that we saw is that I think you can draw, we can look to a few things that were mentioned today. The first is empathy, right? We need to be able to not just respond, but listen, as Amelie says, to one another, right? The second is that we can collaborate, like music teaches us to collaborate. So music teaches us to feel, to listen through feeling. It teaches us to collaborate. And then, as was talked about towards the end, improvisation is essential in jazz. But one of the things that we don't pay as much attention to, maybe when we think about improvisation is that you can't improvise if you're not trained to improvise, right? And so having the ability to learn some skills, a common language, as Amelie says, we have the structure of blues, and on top of that, everything is free, right? And so I think that what we need to do as a healthcare system, listening interculturally, is to really help people train to learn the language of caregiving, and then take that language and be able to improvise with it. And what we saw in our study is that the people that had some background in healthcare, understandings of intercultural engagement, and were able to sort of playfully then respond and jump into the tune. But if you take someone that has never played, throw them on stage with a trumpet and tell them to improvise, that will not be an enjoyable experience. And I don't think caregiving is either, if we're not there to support caregivers to really come into that space and give them that support so that they can improvise playfully.
Thank you, Jenny. And for the audience, Jenny travels across the world thinking about music, equity, capturing musics that may be forgotten, and at the same time playing with people across the world with tango and fiddle. And thank you, Jenny. Wonderful words. Well, I'm going to end today. I wish I could read all of the beautiful things that are coming in from the audience. I think we are definitely belonging. We belong together. Music, Alzheimer's disease, brain health, it's one and the same. Caregiving is part of our mission. And wow, thank you all. We will try to answer questions from people offline, but anyways, thanks most of all, I think, to our musicians. We are going to be looking for you and listening to you for many years to come. And the science will go on as well, and so will Josh's films. So thank you all. Bye.
Are you done?
Got the world on a string, sitting on a rainbow. Got the string around my finger. What a world, what a life. I'm in love. I've got the song that I sing. I can make the rain go anytime I move my finger. Lucky me, can't you see? I'm in love. Life is a beautiful thing as long as I hold the string. I'd be a silly so-and-so if I should ever let go. I've got the world on a string. I can make the rain go anytime I move my finger. Lucky me, can't you see? I'm in love. Life is a beautiful thing as long as I hold that string. I'd be silly so and so if I should ever let go. I've got the world on a string, sitting on the rainbow. Got the string around my